You know what time it is. I've got a ton of progress done this month, and I am very excited to share it. So cue the background music. It's devlog time. Fluidity in the movement was the main focus for this month, and I think I've done a pretty good job at making the game rather satisfying to play. So far, the player has multiple different movement options: jumping, sliding, wall jumping, wall running, grappling, and rail grinding, but I do plan on adding more in the future, such as dashing, diving, and vaulting. I also added momentum to the game, allowing the player to maintain high speeds by performing certain actions, such as jumping off of a wall and grinding on rails. I think the momentum mechanic actually adds a lot more to the game than I initially thought, as the boost of speed you get after successfully doing cool tricks really adds to the fluidity of the movement. Now, you actually have an incentive to chain together different and complex actions. In addition to the movement, I started working on the core gameplay loop, such as implementing a way for the player to actually die and respawn. This was important as now the game was in a state where I could make a level and play it from start to finish. After the addition of the momentum mechanic, I realized that speedrunning the game was actually quite fun, so I added a timer that displays the amount of time it took you to complete a level. With regards to the UI, I still need to add menus to my game, something I've been dreading for quite a while. Luckily, that's a problem for future me to deal with. Lastly, after a few small polish effects like particles were added, I made a test level that showcased each one of Midas' abilities, hopefully teaching the player how each one works before I implement a proper tutorial. I then built the game and uploaded it to itch, a site to share and play games made by others. I sent the link to a few of my friends to test it out, and they gave me some feedback, as well as found a few very annoying bugs, some of which I still need to fix. All in all, it was a very productive month. Now, let's take a look at how I implemented these mechanics into my game in the first place. You saw the name of this chapter, so what is raycasting and what does it have to do with the movement mechanics I added? Well, you can think of raycasting as sort of laser beam that can detect and output certain information. I'll show you the Wikipedia article for this topic, but it's even more convoluted than last time, so you're just gonna have to take my word for this one. In my game, I need to detect whether the player is on the ground or not, so that I can limit when they can jump. To do this, I shoot a ray downwards from the center of the player and search for objects on the ground layer. If it detects an object on that layer, I know they are in contact with the ground, so they can jump whenever they press the jump key. Without this, the player will be able to jump as many times as they like in midair, which isn't exactly what I'm going for. Now, that was a pretty simple utilization for raycasting. The rail grinding mechanic was a very different story. First, the rails consist of a spline, basically just a curved line controlled by 4 control points, and an edge collider, an editable line that detects collisions. I shoot a ray downwards from the player and detect any objects on the rail layer. If the player is colliding with the rail, I set the player's gravity to 0 and set their velocity to the perpendicular vector of the surface as normal. Whew, math, am I right? Basically, I just move them along the line based on the incline they're on. Overall, raycasting itself isn't too difficult of a concept, yet it can be extremely powerful when used correctly. I mentioned before how I sent a prototype of my game to a few of my friends to check out. While watching them play, I realized a few things that I could change about my game to make it more inclusive to new players. Before I had actual testers, I was the only one playing the game, so, I may or may not have gotten slightly good. It was interesting to get a new perspective on the game from someone who hadn't played it before. First, I noticed that the wall running was very difficult for new players. This was a really quick fix, simply reduced the amount at which the player falls while running along the wall, yet the move immediately became more satisfying and forgiving. Next, they also discovered a few interesting bugs and glitches in my game, one of which required the player to restart the game if it happened to them. Basically, every time the player wall jumps, they flip directions so that they can immediately perform more wall jumps. However, if the player died before they turned around again, they would be permanently running or backward the entire game. This, as you can see, caused quite a few issues. Luckily, to fix this, all I had to do was just reset the player's facing direction every time they died. No biggie. Another thing that I mentioned before was speedrunning the game. While playing with my friends, we tried racing each other to see who could get to the end first. I realized that if I were to expand upon the way gaining speed worked in my game, I could make speedrunning much more interesting. But first, I obviously needed a timer system so that we could more accurately tell the time it took to complete the level. This was my first time working with GUIs, so I had to do some research before I could even attempt trying to make a timer. For some reason, I just could not get it to show up in game, and it was all because of the different screen resolutions of the Unity editor and the web version of my game. All I had to do was check one simple box that automatically scaled the GUI depending on the resolution. After that debacle, I wanted to change how I handled speed. Before, you couldn't really dynamically gain or lose speed, which meant that if you just didn't die, you'd have more or less the exact same time as anyone else who didn't have to respawn. To change this, I added momentum. Basically, you have a minimum speed and a maximum speed. Every frame, your speed decreases until it reaches a minimum speed, but certain actions, such as sliding and wall jumping, can give a boost to your speed, capping at the max speed. This way, you can keep moving at your maximum speed if you perform a bunch of tricks, which I think is very engaging for the player and gives them an incentive for pulling off more complicated chains of moves. This was a very productive month for my game, and I'm so excited because it's really starting to come together. Before I briefly talk about what's coming up next, I'd like to announce that the prototype for Project Midas is finally publicly released on itch.io. Now you can play my game and judge me for my poor level design. No downloads required, just click the link in the description to play in your browser. In addition to the public release of Project Midas, all of the code for my game now has a Github page. If you're a competent programmer, don't look at it. I am more than aware that my code looks like a 4-year-old trying to spell their name. Anyway, if you are interested, link is in the description as well. Alright, so what's next for my game? Well, next month, I'm hoping to focus on the visuals and UI system. This means creating the start, pause, and level select menus, updating the visuals for the timer, in addition to finishing all the art and animation assets. If time permits, I'm also hoping to start on the lighting, sound, and music, but that might have to be saved for the very end, once my game starts to look more like a proper game. Anyway, thank you so much for watching this far. Make sure to check out my itch page often for new updates and early sneak peeks of what I'm working on next. Bye.